part of it is we think, oh, well, the Ten Commandments is something that's old-fashioned or it's outdated or it's not as relevant for us today. And the struggle becomes this, is that Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but he came to fulfill the law. And the Ten Commandments is an opportunity that God is communicating to his people the standards in which they can live free. It wasn't done. We think of the Ten Commandments as sometimes as rules that God has set to restrict us, but it's really not. When you start reading through them and you start studying the background and the scripture that surrounds all of the experiences that are pertaining to this extreme moment that God has given his people, that he has delivered, you see so many beautiful things of the heart of God, as the Father heart of God, that he's desiring for his people to not just have experienced freedom, but to live in that freedom on a regular basis. When I say regular basis, meaning every day. And he's teaching them and he's given them this opportunity. And so when I look at this moment, in history today, I want to do something a little bit different. I want to look at what leads up to that. And then about halfway through this sermon, I want to go to what happens after the Ten Commandments are given. And then we're going to launch in the next several weeks back to each one of those and study them out and allow the Lord to speak to us. Okay, in Exodus chapter 19, before we get there, what has happened? Well, the story of Exodus is an incredible story because it talks about the birth of Moses. Now, Moses, in and of himself, if he was standing before us, wouldn't seem to be that incredible of a person because he's probably less than average. But he's still the fact that he was born and he was delivered is a miracle in and of itself. He grows up, and for 12 years, his mother teaches him the ways of God. And for the next season of his life, up till he is 40, Pharaoh trains him in the ways of Egypt. And in the ways of Egypt means that he's training him the skills so that he can lead the Egyptians. And it's around 40 that he sees one of his own being persecuted, a slave, that anger rises up and he kills one of these Egyptians, and he has to flee. Now, he spends the next 40 years of his life as a shepherd for Jethro. And in those 40 years, so if you do the math, Moses was 40 when he left, and now he's 80 whenever God speaks to him and asks him to go back. Now, in that 40 years, I don't know why God allowed him to be there for 40 years having to struggle in the desert. Because the desert is not a beautiful place where, I don't think any of us want to live in the desert. It's not a place where there's going to be an abundance of water. It's not an abundance of anything. It's a dry and a desolate place. But God allowed Moses to be there for 40 years. And I'm thoroughly convinced that the reason that God allowed Moses to be there for 40 years is because it took Moses 40 years to get to a place where he had unlearned what Egypt had attached to his life. And there are so many times in our lives that it takes us a season to unlearn what we think we know. There's so many times that we think we know what God is doing when we are not well versed in his scripture. We think we know everything. When tragedy strikes, we think we know the answer. Whenever good things happen, we think we know the answer. And we've grown up in a way where we think what we think we know turns out to not really be the truth. It's exactly what Moses has experienced. The way that he was raised and seeing this moment, there's something that rises up in him for him to kill the Egyptian and then him to flee. And for those 40 years, he shepherds, and God speaks to him in the burning of a bush. And in the burning of the bush, and I don't have time to lay all of this out this morning, but if you are intrigued, you should go read the story again and read through the whole process of the burning bush experience. Because it's God calling this man, who the last time that they seen him was a murderer, to go back to these people and lead the Israelites out of slavery. And he does. Through that moment, God speaks to him. He goes back. He delivers the people out of Egypt through a series of 10 plagues. It's an incredible story. From that moment that they are delivered out of Egypt, they go on this journey, and on this journey they come up against the Red Sea where the Egyptians are pursuing them to kill them. Can I tell you that when you are in between somewhere and nowhere and it looks like the enemy is closing in on you, that you're in the right place for God to provide a miracle that you could not think or imagine was even possible? These people are sitting on the banks of the Red Sea, cursing God, mad. God delivered us. We were better off in Egypt. When I read through this story, it's kind of mind-blowing to me, because why would these people that now have experienced freedom be willing to run back to the very thing that God set them free from? Can I just tell you that God doesn't perform miracles in your life so that you will fail, so that you will live defeated, so that you will not make it, so you'll be a joke to everyone. God performs miracles in your life to testify to the glory of His Son, Jesus, that He is still alive and still on the throne and still works the miracles that are needed in your life and in the lives of so many that need a touch of God in theirs. And it doesn't matter on what banks that you stand and what situation or what obstacle seems so big that you can't get across. Can I tell you that when you stand at that, all you need to do is to be still and know that He is God. And if you'll just be still and know that He is God, and you will be patient and you will wait on God to show up, He will show up. And not only will He show up, He will give you the victory, and then He will defeat the enemy because He is faithful. So it's what God does. It's who He is. God delivers the people out of Egypt, splits the Red Sea, does more than they could think or imagine, and puts them en route to Mount Sinai. In the desert, they are in a journey to get there. On this journey, God provides water. He provides manna. He feeds them. He provides their necessities. To get there, to teach them what He wants them to learn for the success of their whole life, to be passed down from generation to generation to generation so that we could live free. So I pick up in Exodus chapter 19. This is just a little summary of what had happened. And here's what it says in verse 1. It says, on the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. And after they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Now this is the mountain of God. This is the place where Moses is going to meet with Him in this extremely powerful moment that spanned out on over a period of 40 days. In verse 3 it says, then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and that you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt. What did He do to Egypt? He let the Israelites walk across on dry ground, and when they entered into the ground of that sea, what happened? The waves overtook them, and He destroyed them. That's what happened. He said, they've seen what I've done. They've seen my delivering hand. They've seen my provision. Now, I want you to remind them. He said to them, you've seen what I did to Egypt. Then He says this. He says, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. I picked you up and I brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. And although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. He tells Moses this, and if you need any kind of like a cross-reference, do you recognize the phrasing in any part of the New Testament? Where the Apostle Peter writes, you are a holy nation, a royal priesthood, chosen. You are set apart. And it's exactly what He's saying to them. The whole point of the 10 Commandments, this whole revelation that God's going to give Moses to convey to the people, the whole point of it was this, is that we were set free to live free. Now, I know it sounds like a simple concept, but do you understand that deliverance comes freedom, and from the decisions that we make from then on determines how much freedom that we live in? The things that try to control us, The same things that try to dictate to us the level of which we're going to serve God are the same things that they are facing then, are the same things that happen to us now. When you think about it, did God split the Red Sea, provide water from a rock and manna from heaven so that these people would have to live as slaves to their own freedom? You ever heard someone say, well, you know what, I have freedom and you can't tell me what to do? Friends, that's not true freedom. You will become a victim of your own freedom. If you have no laws governing your life, you will become a victim because there are no absolutes. And we live in a day and time where we don't like absolutes. We don't like for anyone to tell us that the way that we're living is wrong. We don't like for anyone to challenge what we do. I can tell you, for me personally, I don't like it when somebody says, Johnny, you're wrong. At first, I want to defend myself. But the truth about it is that God didn't set me free through the power of Jesus Christ so that I would become a victim of the freedom that He paid for. I don't have to be bound to the things that controlled me before now that I've experienced the deliverance power of God Himself. Now, for the Old Testament people, this is the fact that they were slaves in Egypt. They were not trained in the military arts of war, so they couldn't defend themselves. So what did the enemy have them do? He wanted them to be a slave, unable to defend themselves, to fight against the enemy. He wanted them to be a victim of shame, a victim of guilt because of decisions that were made of their forefathers. He wanted them to live in the dysfunction over and over and over and help them build the empire in which they were creating. He said, the enemy wants us the same way to live as a victim after we've experienced freedom, to miss the things that He delivered us from. The enemy would shout to us, or maybe he comes in a still small whisper to you to say, you know, you had it better when you were living there. But the truth about it is memories are so much better than the reality of what they were when they happened. When we read the story, when you look at the story, there's none of us that would say, man, they had it pretty good in Egypt. I mean, they were victorious in Egypt. I mean, they were the absolute standard of what a free nation looked like. No, it is not anything close to that. And now God has said, I want you to remember what I've done to Egypt. I want you to think about what I've done. I've carried you on eagle's wings to myself because I desire a relationship with you. He said, look, I'm God. I don't have to do anything to impress myself. The things that I do for you, the miracles that I perform for you is because I'm carrying you in a relationship to myself. You should love me more. Because to whom much is given, much is required. See, it's that kind of love that builds the opportunity to break an alabaster jar like Mary did at His feet. To know who you were, but who God was making you. To know that if you had been a common slave, now delivered and en route to a promised land, and God's going to say, I'd set you free so that you would live free. Now here's the struggle of which we come to, is that we think that whenever we experience the deliverance of Christ, when we experience the deliverance of God's power in our lives, is we think that all we have to do then is enjoy the journey. And that's simply not the case. Everything about our lives, once we've experienced Jesus Christ, and whether you have experienced Jesus Christ or you have not, and you're here searching, I believe that there's something beautiful and right in each and every one of us, that God is bringing us to Himself so that we can live this life He's called us to live. I believe that with all of my heart. I believe that God is trying to deliver us from the things that have kept us a slave. And once He delivers us, then what happens? We have to decide to live in a disciplined mentality. Meaning that God's not going to deliver you and give you no moral compass to live by. He said, I'm going to give you these 10 things that if you do them, it will change your life, your family's life, your nation. It will change everything about you. And so what happens is these 10 things that God gives them has been looked at as the law. But the law is not something that restricted them. The law is something that freed them. Because as you're going to see as we go through this week by week, is that these things were such an incredible, they were such a given opportunity that they weren't even that difficult. There's not one of us that would say, man, when he said we're just supposed to love him only, that's impossible. No, it's just a simple requirement when everything has been given to us. When he tells us things like don't steal, don't lie, don't cheat, don't covet your neighbor's wife. We say, none of us go, man, that's just unfair. You don't even know my neighbors. None of us would say that. But when you don't study it out and when you look at it and we live in this mentality where we are taught that any kind of moral guideline is a repulsive thing against our freedom. But I'm thankful for guidelines and I'm thankful for principles that lead us. For example, I'm thankful that when my kids were in elementary school, there was a fence that kept them out of the road. Now, if my son would have come home and said, Dad, I disagree with the fence. They ought to trust every one of us that's 5 to just know not to go in the road. Can I tell you, there are times that if we don't have guidelines and principles in our life, boundaries, let's call them boundaries, if we don't have boundaries that we live by, that we will wander into a road of oncoming traffic of the enemy unintentionally because we're chasing something that has distracted us. Just like kids that play kickball. Look, I watched my cousin get run over by a car. We were playing duct tape ball. We take newspapers. We were so rich. We took newspapers, put it up, wrapped it in duct tape, took a broom handle, unscrewed it from the broom, and we played we call tape ball, duct tape ball. It's really an extravagant sport. You should Google it. We hit it from the one end. We hit it out of our grandmother's lawn into a busy road of South 4th Street in Monroe, Louisiana. And he runs out across, and he holds it up, coming back across the street, holds it up to us, and boom. Now, he lived, but it was a scary moment. I don't know why he didn't look both ways. Maybe it's because he wasn't old enough to pay attention. He was distracted. It's easy for us to become distracted when we have no biblical boundaries in our life. It's easy for us to think that God has set us free so we can do whatever. And that's just not the case. It was them doing whatever that led them to Egypt in the first place. Egypt was never God's intended purpose for his people. But it was their decision because they didn't want to be governed by the principles that God had laid out. Now he delivers them. He brings them to this moment. He says, I set you free so that you could live free. I'm going to give you these 10 things. Now he goes on in the different ascents that Moses makes to the top of the mountain. He gives them several other things, but in these 10 to govern them, speaks to them and the people, and he puts requirements on who could go up. So they're set free to live free. They're given these 10 things to live by. And these incredible things happen along the way. But now I want to fast forward from when the 10 Commandments are given and why they were given to at the end of Exodus chapter 32 when Moses comes down the mountain for the last time, what has happened? Or when he comes down from the mountain of receiving, when he comes down this time, what has taken place? Because it would just make sense to us when we talk about the story that if God parted the Red Sea, provided water from a rock and manna from heaven, if he provided miracle after miracle, that would just make sense that if God said to wait for 40 days at the base of a mountain while he spoke with Moses and gave him what they needed, that it would just make sense. It would just seem to make sense that it would be an easy instruction to follow. Like when someone does something for me, when someone blesses me, it makes me, it just seems like that it would be so difficult to betray them. You know what I mean? It just seems like if someone goes out of their way to do something incredible for me, that I wouldn't want to cause them pain initially. Here God's delivered them, given them these 10 things. And in Exodus chapter 32, when we fast forward, here's what it says. It says, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. 40 short days. Maybe they're long days. I don't know how long the daylight was. I didn't study that out, and I apologize that I didn't, but I didn't see it really that relevant. 40 days is not a long time compared to an eternity. And what happens in chapter 32 is they grow frustrated in the waiting. Can I tell you that if we were set free to live free, I want you to know the second, that who you are, who we truly are, is tested in the waiting. Is tested in the waiting. I don't know why God doesn't do things sooner. I don't know why He doesn't show up at certain moments. I can't explain it. All I know that is if God set me free to live free, that in the waiting is where it's going to be, my character is going to be tested. Everything about me is going to be tested. And there are going to be some that God takes to the mountaintop, but on the other side of it, if God says, I want you to wait here because great things are coming to you, then it just makes sense that we would wait there. But the mountaintop is not the same as the base. There's beautiful things that mountaintops provide, but at the base of this mountain, as Moses is receiving revelation from God, as he's receiving revelation and God's doing incredible things, God's speaking to him. They are at the base of the mountain, growing frustrated and waiting. And what do? They make for themselves a god to worship. They take gold, melt it down, and form a calf. Form a golden calf. So it's a symbol of Baal worship. Baal worship is the worship of pervertedness, of a mindset that opposes God. But it was not Baal that delivered them out of Egypt. But it was that worship that they returned to whenever they became impatient. Now, when I say that, it may not hit you the same. Because you think, what does that have to do with me? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because there are so many times in our life that when we're in the waiting, we return to what we worship before we begin to worship God. Because we don't like waiting. We don't like waiting in those moments where we don't understand what God's up to. We don't like waiting in those moments whenever we will celebrate the thing that God does and then grow frustrated because the next season doesn't happen quick enough. Jesus comes to this earth born of a virgin. You see the incredible miracle surrounded in the birth of Jesus, but then you fast forward and you see him speak at 12, and from that you don't see anything else or hear anything else about the life of Jesus until he comes onto the scene and he performs a miracle at the wedding of Canaan. What if Jesus, 100% man, but 100% God, having in his humanity the choice to choose what he was going to do in the waiting moment. He did not choose to betray or to be distracted or to stray away. He did not worship the gods of that life, of that culture. He stayed true to the one true worship of his God, of his Father, the one who sent him on mission. And Jesus had a public ministry of 3.5 years. He prepared 30 years in his humanity for 3.5 years of public ministry. But in our life, we get mad if we would rather want 30 years of public ministry and only 3.5 years of preparation. We want to be delivered, but we don't want to go through the waiting. And you can sit back and grow distracted and not pay attention all you want to. But when you set up appointments and walk in my office because of what's happening in your life, when your family's falling apart, look me in my good eyeball and listen. The reason your family's falling apart isn't because you weren't delivered. It's because you built an altar of worship to another God in the culture in which you live. And that's why your family's falling off path. Now, that may be hard, but we got powerless pulpits that don't preach about the truth of when we start worshiping the culture that we are living in. We don't like standards. And we wonder why church and all of these things are going by the wayside. It's because when God gave us a chance to hear something from the mountaintop, we grew frustrated. We no longer weep for our sin. We no longer weep for the brokenness in our family. We no longer weep for the brokenness of marriages. We no longer weep in a culture that has turned itself away because we begin to worship what they worship and then wonder why we are falling apart. That seems hard, doesn't it? But God set us free so we would live free. Man, I know, Pastor, I just struggle. I struggle with my temper. Okay. Look, I believe with all my heart there's not one of us sitting in this room that doesn't at some point struggle with becoming angry. But did God set you free so that you would let your temper ruin everything? No. So instead of priorities being right, we get frustrated in the waiting because these were the people that God delivered. But why are you passionate about this? Because I believe in this really is the point of why we live distracted, discouraged, and desperate for a move of something in our lives other than a miracle of God. Because we don't like the waiting. But in the waiting is a beautiful moment for faithfulness to be tested, because in chapter 32 and verse 17 of Exodus, Moses is coming down the mountain, and Joshua, who has been camped halfway for 40 days as Moses received revelation of the laws and the commandments of God in face-to-face communication with Father God. Joshua was halfway down the mountain with no cloud, no voice, no presence of God, and no Moses, his leader. He could have heard something, but he didn't experience it himself. But he was close enough to Moses to know something powerful was happening there, and he was close enough to the base to know that distraction was happening and they had begun to go astray. He says to them, hey, something's going on at the base of the mountain. Moses speaks to him that regardless of what's happening between the mountaintop and the base of the mountain, when you love and you serve God, when you live in between, you are just happy to be a part, and you don't get distracted by what you hear beneath you. You stay focused on what is above you. There is plenty of junk at the base level to distract us from the destiny that God has for our life. Joshua was found faithful. Now, I believe, and I don't have time to go into it this morning, I believe that it was through these moments that Joshua was really set apart and designated to be the next leader of the children of Israel, to lead them into the promised land. I believe it happened because of moments like this, where he was faithful when others were faithless. I just grew distracted. We all do. Do you think that every one of us in our humanity don't have moments where we get distracted from what God's trying to do in our life? Can we just be real? When we want certain things, but it seems like our finances aren't there, where the very thing we prayed for God gives us, and then we're mad that he gave it to us. We pray, God, give me a family, and then you find out that those kids can be a little bit ornery. God, let me be a daddy. And you find out being a daddy is more than just showing up to a ball game and being funny. You learn that being a mother isn't just you're the greatest mother. It ain't all about Mother's Day, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. That there's trials along the way. And you have plenty of examples of how not to do it. But when you're given the one, why would you ever be distracted by the other? Because who we are is tested in the waiting. Now, the next thing that I see in this is that Moses is on top of the mountain experiencing an incredible thing with God. He's experiencing an incredible moment. And his mountaintop experience was not theirs. Many of the people at the base, it was not their experience. Moses' experience was not theirs. So much so that they built an idol to worship. Because if you don't do it on my time frame, if you don't do it the way I think it should be done, if you don't do it the way I like it, I'll build something to worship myself. Can you imagine how heartbroken Moses is to come off of this experience with God, to walk into the frustration? Because guess what? It wasn't just the fact that Moses had been on top of the mountain and Joshua was camped halfway. It's the fact that when he returned, his brother Aaron's the one who kind of led the charge of stupidity. Isn't it amazing the things that people can do whenever they know right from wrong and they lead the charge of something they know is in direct opposition of what God desires? People say, well, I just don't really believe that. Okay. All right. And you have this mountaintop experience, which I believe I would compare to salvation for us, where God delivers us from ourselves, from our poor decisions, from our distracted ways. Gives us a mountaintop experience of where then we return from the mountaintop and walk back into real life. And guess what? When you walk back into real life, everybody else's reaction may not be what you desired. If you're in this sanctuary today and you have a moment today with God and you are saved, and you walk out of this room and you go to someone in your family and you say, man, today I found you. I gave my life to you. Do you think they're going to be like, oh, praise God, lead me in the way? Do you know that people don't want to admit that you're right, because to admit that what your experience is right means that they have to own that they are wrong? The encouragement that I received as an early believer didn't happen at the base of a mountain. It happened with other people who had a mountaintop experience. I remember walking and going to people and saying, man, I got saved today. And they're like, you'll be back. You'll be back. Man, I've been where you've been. Can I tell you, at the base of that mountain, with no mountaintop experience, when you are at that place, it becomes a dangerous thing, because all you can think about is a past that was a lot better than where you are now. If all we can do is look back and go, man, God delivered me out of the Red Sea, but where's your mountain experience now? Where's your moment now? Because if we don't own this moment now, we will wander for 40 years in a wilderness that God never designed for us to live in. Our impatience will lead us to a longer setback than we would have ever desired for ourselves. It means that there'll be moments whenever we don't understand what's happening that we'll say, God, regardless of everybody else's reaction, I know that you're in control. I know that you're still faithful. I know that you still part Red Seas. I know that you'll open the heavens and pour out a blessing on me I don't have room enough to contain. I'm blessed to be able to give. And just because my job dries up don't mean I quit giving what you've asked, because you have been faithful to me, too faithful for me to give up on what you've done. There's something about mountaintop experiences that built a faith in Moses that wanted to inspire the hearts of the people. But when he comes off of that mountain and sees that their reaction is one that is culturally wrong, or not culturally, but they have begun to worship their culture, have begun to return to the ways of Egypt. They hadn't had 40 years of unlearning Egypt. Moses, in the way that God has designed him to lead, there's this deliverance of Egypt that was a continual process out of these people long after God delivered them. Listen to me. There are things in your life from your past that when God sets you free, you got to let them go. Because your mountaintop experience is a beautiful moment so that you don't live in a baseline living. God set you free, so let go of the moments you were a slave. Let go of the moments that you were done wrong. Let go of the moments that you were disloyal, that you were betrayed when you were done wrong. Let go of the moments where you were a slave. Let go of the addiction. Let go of the mindset. Let go of all of it, because it is not where God desires us to live. It's in our relationship. It's in the mountaintop experience that we get an opportunity to receive revelation of what God is doing and that He is still in control. And just because everybody else doesn't feel the same thing doesn't mean that God is not in control. So we don't grow frustrated. We stay the course. We pray for mercy like Moses did so that God may give it. Because our mountaintop moments carry us through our wilderness journeys. They carry us through those moments. They carry us through them where we don't know and we don't understand and we don't have it all figured out. Let me ask you something. If you had it all figured out and you knew every answer, then who would you serve, yourself or God? If you knew everything, God's saying, I got you. If I delivered you, I'll deliver you. I just want you to be in relationship with. Why would you? I carried you out of slavery. Why would you not want this? Why would you not want this? Now, it just seems to make sense that if we're just talking about it as just a normal group of people today, that for somebody that had given so much, if somebody had given so much, then doesn't it just seem that the reasonable response would be to obey? I don't know how it works for you, but I've been to the bay, and I ain't seen none of you split the water in the bay and walk out on dry ground. All right? So what does that mean? That as awesome as you may be, I'm not supposed to worship you. I'm supposed to worship Him. That if I'm hungry and have no way to eat, and you provide a meal, am I supposed to worship you, or am I supposed to worship Him? So we become kind of distracted because we don't like waiting. And our mountaintop experience is now something in the past, because now we come down and we deal with real life. How did Moses react when he got back to real life? He's pretty mad about it. He actually took the tablets with the Ten Commandments on them and he destroyed them. Threw them down and broke them. I got to tell you, I've read this story several times prior to this series. When I was going through it, I was like, oh, okay, all right. I don't know why it never dawned on me the fact that it stuck out to me that Moses broke the tablets at the seal. Have you ever gotten mad because God's done something incredible in your life only to return to some dysfunction and can't figure out why they don't get it? Can I tell you, I'm pretty sure I broke some tablets in my life. I'm pretty sure that I've grown frustrated in seasons in my life where I can't quite figure out why. But here's what I've learned. Is that Christ has set us free so that we will live free. What that means is He delivered us, now we have to gain some discipline. That when God sets you free, He does not desire for you to live bound by the structure and the culture in which you live. He called you out of something and into something. And when He calls you into something, that means you are governed by a different set of laws. Does it mean that you go out and break the laws? I'm not telling you that. I'm telling you this, that you live by a different mindset than this world. You don't bury yourself in the things of this world hoping it'll give you deliverance, because it will not. What is success? Is success you being noticed, you being celebrated, you having the most money in the bank that everybody else thinks, man, they are successful? Or is success standing before God and hearing, well done, my good and faithful servant? Is winning receiving an award, a plaque, your name on a brick of a building? Or is it for your name to be written in the book of life? Because if Christ sets you free, He brings you to Himself and gives you the ability. And so that if you go through it, then God trusts you with it. God's trusting you for this season and this moment that you're in. He is trusting you. Because He doesn't want you. He doesn't want you to have a high-priced moment for a cheap thrill. He doesn't desire for you to have a moment of destruction that costs you everything. He doesn't desire for you to be unfaithful in a moment because you were tired of waiting, so that you have to look your loved ones in the eyes and tell them what you've done. He doesn't desire for that to happen. It was never His plan. It wasn't deliverance that was the issue. It was discipline. At the base of a mountain, waiting to receive what God has said. Christ has set us free so we'll live free. So this isn't binding, this is free. Why? Because whenever April and I are fighting, I got to remember that I'm not fighting with her and she's not fighting with me. We're fighting against the enemy. The enemy is trying to intercept the destiny that God has given. If I don't understand that and I'm not governed by that, I'll begin to think that she no longer supports what God, or I don't support her. Do you see how the enemy comes in and works? That whenever my kids begin to frustrate me, I just go, It's whatever. All right, I go, God, you gave them. I prayed for them. I prayed for you to give. Now I'm praying for you to take them away. God doesn't set you free so that you'll live bound. God sets you free so that you'll live in freedom. Freedom has a standard. It's a delivered lifestyle that walks into discipline and says, you know what? If God has set me free so that I'll live free, then I'm not going to repeat the cycle. I'm not going to repeat the cycle. Why am I telling you this story in an order that doesn't make sense for a series we're about to go into? Because I want you to see the beginning and the dysfunction by the end of it in 40 short days. I can tell you that when we talked about 52 days that Nehemiah rebuilt the wall in Judah in our past series, there's a lot of times that there's a lot of things that can happen in our life in a short span of 40 days. In 40 days of waiting, these people were willing to turn their back on the God that has split the Red Sea. What is your 40-day moment? Judas had a price that he could be purchased. You've got to start to look and say, I've already been bought, so I'm not going to be paid for by an enemy that can't afford me. If Christ sets us free, then he wants us to live free so that we don't repeat the cycle. I know some of you have incredible stories of how God delivered you. How God delivered you out of a life of addiction. And now here you sit and have an opportunity to lead your family in a way that it doesn't repeat the process. I'm begging you today, every one of us, get to the top of that mountain so you can hear from God. Because when you return to the base, there's going to be a whole lot of dysfunction. You got to know how to lead them, and you got to know how to direct them, because God set you free so you'll know what freedom looks like and so that you can live that way. We get to discover how we can do that. Come on, stand with me today. If I told you today that God desires for none of us to be enslaved in a culture that is not His, would you believe me? Would you believe me if I told you that God doesn't desire for you to be a failure? Would you believe me if I told you that God doesn't desire for you to be broken in all the wrong ways? Would you believe me if I told you that God desires for none of you to be an addict? Would you believe me if I told you that there is a better way? And if you do, then what is that way? It's a relationship of deliverance in which God paid a high price. So now we develop discipline and we say, God, how can I? How can I? And He says, it's through the strength that I will give you through the power of the Holy Spirit. There's so much that is symbolic between this day that happened with the people of Israel and the day of which we celebrate as Pentecost. God desires for us to walk in a power of which we are not controlled. That whenever the serpents of this life try to strike us, we walk over them. When the poisonous things of this world try to destroy us, it cannot harm us because we belong to a different kingdom. Because He's called us out and brought us in. So the next time the cycle desires to repeat, if you've missed it, if you can't control your tongue, if you have dropped the ball, then guess what? Get deliverance and live in freedom so that you don't repeat the process. It's what cowards do. Be grown enough today to admit where you're wrong and admit your need in Christ and live in freedom. It will take more strength to do that than it will ever to build an image that you just want to enjoy the pleasure of this time and this moment. Father, today I thank you for an opportunity to look at your word and to know, to understand that between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you've always desired to be in relationship with your people. But it has been your people at times that have built their own worship sets, their own setup of worship and their styles and their preference. But Lord, today we lay our preference down. We lay our styles down and we say, God, we just want to worship you. And God, today that worship begins because you've delivered us. Lord, because you delivered us. And there's some under the sound of my voice that have to experience deliverance today. And all that simply means, Lord, today you want to save them from themselves because you did not create them to live bound the way they are. And Lord, you did not set up your church so that the gates of hell would prevail against it. Absolutely, you set it up so that the gates of hell would not prevail. So that we would stand the test of time in the face of adversity. And no matter what becomes legal and no matter what becomes a moral absolute in this culture, your word has given us the ability to live free. So God, may we embrace it. And today, may someone receive you. And may someone be empowered to leave here, embracing the opportunity to make a difference in the world in which will frustrate them. For Lord, all we are witnesses of what we believe to be true. The mountaintop experiences that we've had and the moments that we have seen your hand at work, all we have is our story. People can testify that they believe God's done something, but whenever we are no longer true to what you have called us to do, then there is a world that will build an image of worship for themselves because they've lost hope in the waiting. So God, may we stay true. May we take this moment to reflect. And God, may we say, where am I missing it? Will I look up so that I can receive? Will I stop making? God, will we ask ourselves the question, will we stop making you war with everything that you're for? Everything that you're for. Everything that you're for.